you can be in a room like full of people, and that's how I felt, especially being in like elementary school, middle school, just being around people all the time, but like always feeling alone. I would go to my room and pretty much just isolate myself all the time because my family wasn't really a family anymore. We were kind of broken. I just don't see the reason as to why I'm here. Like, why would my life be like this, like all the time? When I was 8 years old, that's when like the videos started coming up. That's when I started to really struggle with that and to consume myself with that. I didn't know it was a struggle. I didn't really know like what it was because I was only 8 years old. My name is Joseph Veron. I was born in Sligo, Louisiana, a really small town close to New Orleans. I feel like that's what a lot of people know Louisiana for. I grew up in a Christian household for pretty much my entire life. My family was really strong in their faith in Jesus, and it wasn't until like I was 8 years old when things kind of started to fall apart. That's when my parents got divorced, and that's when our family and house just kind of started to fall apart a little bit. And that's when their faith just kind of didn't necessarily stray, but wasn't as strong as it was before. And so growing up, like I was always taught like to read your Bible. And it wasn't until, like that stuff happened that I really started to just isolate myself away from that because I saw my family break apart. And so I didn't really feel the need to really read my Bible because I was like, okay, that's just what we do is we read our Bible, we go to church on Sundays. But because of my parents' divorce, we didn't really go to church as much as we used to because a lot of our family went to church. And so I think the divorce really just affected not just us, but everyone in our family. And so within the church that we went to, it was a really hard thing to navigate through because there was a lot going on during that time. And so they got divorced, and that's around the same time my struggle with pornography started. As far back as I can remember, that like when I was 8 years old, that's when like the videos started coming up, and that's when I started to really struggle with that and to consume myself with that. I didn't know it was a struggle. I didn't really know like what it was because I was only 8 years old. And at the time I had two older sisters. They're still here. I have five siblings now, but at the time it was just us three. They knew more about the divorce than I did because they were older than I was, so they kind of navigated through that their own way. And so for me, being 8 years old, I didn't really know how to process that. I was also homeschooled like my entire life up until that point when I decided to go to public school. And it was more so a decision like within my family to send us off to public school because my mom at the time was now a single working mother, and so she needed time to really like help out around the house, and to she didn't really have the time to homeschool us as much as she did before, so she sent us to public school. And so it was a huge transition for me going to from homeschool to public school while also dealing with my parents' divorce because at the time like I literally had no idea what was going on at home while also not going on like around me outside, and just adjusting to the whole thing was a really big process for me that I just didn't know how to get through because also my older sisters, they at the time just kind of, because they knew more, they kind of went their own way and they kind of had their own personal things going on. And so at the time like I was just kind of like by myself, and you can be in a room like full of people, and that's how I felt, especially being in like elementary school, middle school, just being around people all the time, but like always feeling alone. Because even when I went home, I would still feel alone. I would go to my room and pretty much just isolate myself all the time because my family wasn't really a family anymore. We were kind of broken and apart. And so I would just stay in my room, and then my mom started seeing this guy, my dad started seeing this woman. They were also at the time going their own way, just like my sisters, but it was kind of a thing that I now understand. At the time I didn't, but just knowing that they were processing it also in their own way, and that they were dealing with the divorce and that they were finding other people. And so that was also really rough for me because we moved around a lot, and I moved between, my mom and my dad, and just seeing them with like seeing my dad get into like different relationships, and the one my mom got into that she's in right now with my stepdad at the time was really like difficult because they would argue a lot, and so they would get into fights like all the time, and so that was another reason why like I just stayed in my room. But it kind of like it got better through the years, but when they first got together it was like almost an everyday thing. So I remember coming home from school, and my mom worked with my grandfather at the time, so I would come home from school, go to his house, then go to my house. And so it was kind of like a hard environment just because my sisters were they were doing their own thing, so they weren't really at the house as much. And so when I was just in my room, but like outside all I would hear is arguing like all the time. And so I would just like put on headphones and play video games. And that's also the pornography struggle still continued to grow, but because I struggled with it when I was 8 years old, I still thought that that was just kind of like a normal thing. I didn't know there was anything bad with it. I just knew that like I felt alone all the time, but whenever I did that, that was a way for me to not feel alone anymore. And so the more I had that mindset that, okay, like when I do this, I don't feel alone, or when I do this, there's some sort of pleasure in it, I would do it more and more and more because it didn't matter where I was always alone. So to me, that was my source. That was my source to kind of like separate myself from everything around me to actually like feel something. And for a while, because I struggled with it for 9 years up until I was 17, that's when I started to actually realize like the toxicity and stuff behind it. But for a while, my mindset was just kind of like, that's how my life is going to be, to growing up and at such a young age, just feeling alone. I kind of always felt that like, that's how the rest of my life was going to be because this is how it is right now. And usually when you think of like your childhood, you remember like great memories and stuff like that. I don't like, I just think of those moments when I was in my room. So like, I would always think like, okay, this is how it's just going to be the rest of my life. Like when I go to high school, when I go to college, like this is just how it's going to be. And so I never had that sense of meaning of what it meant to have a family or be complete because, again, like that's just kind of how I grew up. And so for me, it was also hard, like within the church, because we kind of just stopped at that point. We still went to church, but just not as much as we did like beforehand. So it was kind of like a couple times a month or stuff like that. But once we started going again, it was still kind of the mindset that like, okay, we just read our Bible, we go to church on Sundays. That's just kind of how it is. But when we go home, there's still like the arguing, there's still like the pornography, there's still like the isolation, just all those things. And pornography, I think, in every single case leads to a desire for more. But that desire for more leads to this void of emptiness. Like the more you try to fill it, the more you'll feel empty. So for me, I just kind of always felt like that empty feeling no matter what I did. And I didn't really think that like depression felt that way because I had never looked into that. I just kind of thought that like that was my life. Like it was normal to feel that way. I thought depression was more severe than that. So I don't really, when I talk about that, I know some people struggle with depression like a lot more severe than I have, but I think realizing that like it's not normal to feel lonely and empty all the time was that kind of like confirmation for me that like, okay, I'm probably depressed. And so I remember it didn't matter like what I did. I would always, again, like with pornography, look for that temperamental pleasure and that happiness. But there's a difference between happiness and joy because happiness is based off your circumstance. Joy is there despite your circumstance. So I would always just try to fill the void with like music or affirmation from other people or that sexual pleasure. I'd always try to fill that void, just try to get that happiness that I had never felt or that was kind of like a foreign feeling to me. And it didn't matter like how many times I went to those things, I would still feel empty and void when I got back from those things or when I was going to bed that night. Like nothing ever changed for me. I remember not necessarily having like suicidal thoughts, but thoughts of like, I just don't want to be here. I just don't see the reason as to why I'm here. Like, why would my life be like this, like all the time? Why is it going to be like this? Because that's how I thought that it was always going to be, was just empty and alone and isolated. And I just thought why me? Like I saw people at church who were always like happy, who were always smiling, and they had families and they were all built together and they were all strong and they were all like happy, and like I never had that. So I was always kind of questioning like why our family? Like why is all this stuff going on? Like why did they get divorced when I was 8? Why we moved around like over like 20 times? We never could really like stay in a home. So I never really knew what home felt like. So I was always just having those questions.